The opium fortunes created the wealthiest families in 19th century Britain. We're not talking millions, we're talking billions in today's money. Fortunes built on systematically addicting an entire empire to drugs. And here's what most people don't know. That money didn't disappear. It's still here. In banks you use, in companies you know, in institutions you trust. The families that made fortunes from opium are still wealthy today. The corporations that profited are still operating. And the pattern that made it all possible is happening again right now with prescription opioids. But the story behind it isn't what you think. This wasn't underground crime or black market dealers. This was legal, government-backed, celebrated business. The British Empire directly profited from opium. 15 to 20% of British India's government revenue came from opium sales. The most respected merchants in Britain made their fortunes from the drug trade. And when China tried to stop the addiction, Britain went to war twice to force them to accept the drugs. This was state-sponsored drug dealing at empire scale. Stay tuned, because what you're about to learn will change how you see corporate wealth forever. In this video, we'll uncover the hidden patterns of the opium fortunes. We'll break down each stage using financial records, historical data, and modern corporate connections. You'll see exactly how much money was made, who made it, where it went, and why it matters today. We'll share key facts about the scale of wealth creation that historians often downplay because the numbers are so disturbing. And later, you'll discover the one factor that makes this pattern repeat, the specific economic mechanism that turned addiction into acceptable profit in the 1800s and is doing the exact same thing today with pharmaceutical companies. Because understanding where old money came from helps you see where new money comes from. And the source is often darker than anyone wants to admit. Before we track the fortunes, you need to understand what opium fortunes actually means in scale, not small-time drug dealing, industrial-scale wealth creation from systematic addiction. We're talking about the most profitable commodity trade of the 19th century, more profitable than cotton, more profitable than sugar, more profitable than any legitimate trade good, and it built some of the largest fortunes in British history. The economics of opium were simple and devastating. Opium was grown in British-controlled India. The British East India Company had monopolized production. They forced Indian farmers to grow opium poppies instead of food crops. The opium was processed, packaged, and sold at auction in Calcutta. Private merchants bought it and smuggled it into China, where it was illegal. The merchants made enormous profits. The British government collected taxes and auction revenues, and millions of Chinese people became addicted. Here's the financial mathematics that made it work. Opium cost approximately 1,000 silver dollars per chest to produce and buy at auction in India. That same chest sold for 2,000 to 3,000 silver dollars in China. 100 to 200% profit margin on every transaction, and the transactions were massive. By the 1830s, 40,000 chests were being imported into China annually. Each chest contained 140 pounds of opium. That's 5.6 million pounds of drugs per year, generating profits in the tens of millions of silver dollars annually. Convert that to modern purchasing power, and you're looking at billions of dollars in annual profit. From a single commodity, from a single trade route. All of it illegal under Chinese law, but protected by British military power. This wasn't a black market operation. This was the largest and most profitable trade in Asia, conducted openly, with full government knowledge and protection. And the money flowed everywhere. Merchants who transported the opium made fortunes. Shipbuilders who built the fast clipper ships profited. Insurance companies that insured the shipments earned premiums. Banks that financed the trade collected interest. The British government that taxed the production got revenue. And at the top, a small number of families made generational wealth that would last for centuries. The opium fortunes weren't like modern tech billionaire wealth that appears and sometimes disappears in a generation. This was old money, the kind that buys aristocratic titles, funds universities, establishes hospitals, purchases massive estates, and gets passed down through generations. The kind that becomes so respectable over time that people forget where it came from. The kind that launders itself through philanthropy and time until the source is hidden beneath layers of legitimacy. China in the early 1800s was the wealthiest nation on Earth with a population of 400 million people. They didn't need or want foreign goods. Britain desperately wanted Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain. But China wanted nothing from Britain, so silver flowed from Britain to China to pay for tea. This was economically unsustainable for Britain. They needed something China would buy. They found it. Not something China wanted, but something they could be forced to need. Opium. The British strategy was deliberate. Create addiction in China's population. The addicted would need opium. They would pay silver for it. The silver would flow back from China to Britain. The trade would balance, and British merchants and government would profit enormously. This wasn't an accidental side effect. This was the plan. Use addiction to reverse trade flows. And it worked exactly as intended. By 1820, opium imports to China were exploding. By 1830, the addiction had spread through coastal provinces and was moving inland. By 1839, approximately 2 million Chinese people were addicted. Silver was hemorrhaging out of China, the Chinese economy was destabilizing, and British merchants and government were making unprecedented profits. The human cost was irrelevant. The economic benefit was enormous, and the fortunes were accumulating. When China tried to stop it in 1839 by confiscating and destroying opium stocks, Britain declared war, the First Opium War. The entire purpose was to protect the drug trade and the profits it generated. Britain won, forced China to pay reparations, seized Hong Kong, and made the opium trade even more profitable. Then, when China resisted again, Britain fought the Second Opium War from 1856 to 1860, and this time, they forced complete legalization of opium in China. After legalization, imports exploded, 60,000 chests per year by the 1850s. The addiction spread to 10 to 25% of the adult male population by 1900, and the profits kept flowing for another 60 years until international pressure finally shut down the trade in the early 20th century. By that time, the fortunes were made, the wealth was established, the families were set for generations, and the money had been laundered into legitimate businesses, banks, property, and investments. This is what opium fortunes means. Multi-generational wealth created by systematically addicting millions of people to drugs, protecting that trade with military force, and then using the profits to build business empires that still exist today. We're going to track that money. We're going to see who made it. We're going to follow where it went. And we're going to see why it matters in 2025 when pharmaceutical companies are doing the exact same thing with prescription opioids. Let's start with the merchants, the families who built the distribution networks, the traders who transported 40,000 chests of opium annually, the businessmen who made hundreds of millions selling addiction. Let's start with the opium lords who became the most respected men in British society. Let's start with Jardine, Matheson, and the others who built fortunes that would dwarf most modern billionaires when adjusted for purchasing power. Because understanding who profited is the first step to understanding where the money went. And where it went will surprise you. It went into everything, into banks you use today, into companies that are household names, into institutions that seem completely legitimate. The opium money didn't disappear, it transformed. And tracking that transformation reveals how massive illegal wealth becomes respectable old money. William Jardine was born in 1784 in Scotland, poor farming family, no inheritance, no connections. He became a ship surgeon because it was the only career available to an educated but penniless young man. He sailed to India and China treating sick sailors, and he watched fortunes being made around him while he earned a salary. By 1817, he had saved enough to quit medicine and become a trader, not in legal goods, in opium, because that's where the real money was. James Matheson was born in 1796, also in Scotland, also with no money. He arrived in Canton in 1815 and started working for trading companies. He was brilliant with numbers and ruthless in business. He saw what Jardine saw. Legitimate trade made small profits. Opium made enormous profits. And if you were willing to operate illegally, willing to bribe officials, willing to organize smuggling networks, you could become extraordinarily wealthy. They formed their partnership in 1828 and officially founded Jardine, Matheson and Company in 1832. Within 7 years, they would be the largest opium traders in Asia, Within 20 years, they would have accumulated fortunes equivalent to billions in modern money, and their company would still exist today, nearly 200 years later, worth over $40 billion. Here's how they made their money. They operated a vertically integrated drug distribution system. They bought opium at auction in Calcutta from the British East India Company. Typical price, 1,000 to 2,100 silver dollars per chest. They transported it on their own ships, fast clipper vessels designed specifically for the opium trade. They stored it on floating warehouses anchored off the Chinese coast, outside Chinese territorial control, and they sold it to Chinese smugglers who distributed it inland. Selling price, 2,000 to 3,000 silver dollars per chest. The profit on one chest was 1,000 to 2,000 silver dollars. By the 1830s, Jardine Matheson was moving 30,000 to 40,000 chests annually. Do the math. You have 30 million to 80 million silver dollars in annual profit in the 1830s, when a skilled worker in Britain earned maybe 50 pounds per year, when you could buy a large estate for 10,000 pounds. Jardine and Matheson were making more money annually than most countries' entire national budgets. And they weren't paying taxes on it because the trade was illegal in China. They weren't operating under Chinese law. They had no regulatory oversight, no compliance costs, no legal restrictions. Just pure profit extracted from addiction and transported back to Britain, where it became investment capital, property purchases, political influence, and generational wealth. But the operation required more than just ships and opium. It required corruption at industrial scale. Chinese customs officials had to be bribed, local warlords had to be paid for protection, smugglers had to be organized and financed, distribution networks had to penetrate hundreds of miles inland, banking systems had to move silver from Chinese buyers to British merchants. Insurance had to cover the valuable cargoes, and all of this had to operate continuously despite being completely illegal under Chinese law. Jardine was the operational genius. He built the relationships with Chinese smugglers. He established the credit systems that allowed distributors to buy on loan and pay after sales. He organized the floating warehouses that stayed outside Chinese jurisdiction. He understood that the key wasn't just moving opium, it was creating an entire financial and logistical ecosystem that made opium the foundation of the regional economy. Make enough people dependent on the trade, and stopping it becomes economically impossible even for a government. Matheson was the diplomat and legitimizer. He cultivated relationships with British officials, naval commanders, politicians, and investors. He wrote pamphlets arguing that opium was just another commodity, that China had no right to ban British trade, that free markets meant the right to sell anything to anyone. He framed drug dealing as principled free trade advocacy, and British society, seeing the enormous profits and wanting to believe the justifications, accepted his arguments. By the mid-1830s, Jardine Matheson wasn't just a company. They were a political force. They had their own fleet of armed ships. They had agents throughout coastal China. They had connections to every level of British government. They had investments in multiple industries. And they were making so much money that stopping them would mean disrupting a significant portion of British-Asian trade. Other merchants made fortunes too. Dent and Company was the second largest opium trader. They moved 15,000 to 20,000 chests annually. Russell and Company, an American firm, was heavily involved despite American government disapproval. Dozens of smaller trading houses participated. Banks financed the trade. Insurance companies covered the shipments. Shipping companies built specialized vessels. An entire economic sector existed around opium, all of it generating enormous wealth. When Commissioner Lin Zexu confiscated and destroyed 20,000 chests of opium in 1839, the value destroyed was over 20 million silver dollars. That's how much was sitting in warehouses at that moment. The annual flow was even larger. Jardine personally traveled to London to lobby the British government for military intervention. He provided military intelligence. He advised on strategy. He convinced Foreign Secretary Palmerston that war was necessary to protect British commerce. And he succeeded. The First Opium War made the merchants even wealthier. Hong Kong was ceded to Britain, giving traders a permanent base. 5 Chinese ports were open to foreign trade. British citizens in China were subject to British law, not Chinese law. And while opium wasn't officially legalized, enforcement became impossible. Imports soared. By the late 1840s, 50,000 chests annually. By 1850, 60,000 chests. The profits multiplied. Jardine died in 1843, but his fortune was secured. Matheson managed the company's expansion during the boom years and retired in 1848 as one of the richest men in Britain. He bought the Isle of Lewis in Scotland, one of the largest private estates in Britain, for £190,000. He became a member of Parliament. He was respected as a successful businessman and philanthropist. Nobody asked where the money came from, or if they did, they accepted his framing that it was legitimate trade, not drug dealing. When Matheson died in 1878, his estate was valued at over £1.5 million. In 1878, that was generational wealth. Invested properly, it would compound for over a century. His nephews inherited and expanded the business. Jardine's relatives did the same. The fortunes passed down through generations, growing larger through investments in railways, real estate, banking, and legitimate trade. The opium origin became a footnote, then an embarrassing historical detail, then forgotten by most people. But the money didn't forget. Money remembers. Jardine Matheson still exists today as Jardine Matheson Holdings Limited. They're headquartered in Hong Kong, listed on the London Stock Exchange. They operate in retail, property, motors, restaurants, hotels, construction. Annual revenue over $40 billion. Market capitalization fluctuates but regularly exceeds $20 billion. They're a respected multinational corporation with over 240,000 employees. Their corporate history mentions their founding in 1832. It mentions their role in Hong Kong's development. It talks about their diversification into multiple industries. What it doesn't emphasize is that the company was built on the largest drug distribution network in 19th century history, that their founding capital came from addicting millions of Chinese people to opium, that their first century of operation was funded primarily by drug profits. The company's respectability has been purchased through time and diversification. Other merchant fortunes followed similar paths. Dent & Company's wealth was dispersed through family inheritances and investments. Russell & Company's profits flowed to American families who invested in railroads, manufacturing, and banking. Dozens of smaller trading families took their opium profits and became respectable merchants, landowners, investors. The drug money was laundered through legitimate business over generations until the source became invisible. And here's the critical point. These weren't small fortunes. Jardine and Matheson each made the equivalent of several $1 billion in modern money during their active trading years. That's conservative estimation based on documented transactions. The actual amounts were likely higher because much of the trade was deliberately undocumented to avoid scrutiny. Multiple other merchants made hundreds of millions each. The total wealth generated by the opium trade for British merchants exceeded tens of billions in modern equivalent value. That money didn't evaporate, it compounded. $1 billion invested in 1850 at even modest returns becomes massive wealth by 2025. 175 years of compound growth. That's how old money works. The initial fortune might be made through questionable means, but given enough time and proper investment, it becomes vast wealth that seems completely legitimate because nobody remembers or cares about the origin. But the merchant fortunes were only part of the story, because behind the merchants was an even larger profiteer. The British government itself, the government that monopolized opium production in India, the government that collected taxes on every chest sold, the government that earned 15 to 20% of British India's entire revenue from opium, the government that sent military forces to protect the drug trade, the government that made drug dealing official state policy. That's where the really big money was. Not just merchant profits, but government revenues at empire scale. And that's where we need to look next to understand the true scope of the opium fortunes. The British East India Company controlled India, and the British East India Company had a monopoly on opium production. This wasn't a private company operating independently. By the 1800s, the East India Company was essentially an arm of the British government, governing India on behalf of the Crown, which means the British government directly controlled and profited from industrial-scale opium production, specifically designed to addict Chinese people. Here's how the system worked. The company forced Indian farmers in Bengal and other regions to grow opium poppies instead of food crops. They provided seeds and advances. They controlled the harvest. They processed the raw opium into standardized cakes. They packaged it into chests. And they sold it at auction in Calcutta to private merchants like Jardine and Matheson. The company didn't distribute to China directly because opium was illegal there, but they made sure there was plenty of supply for the merchants who would. The revenue was staggering. In the 1830s, the East India Company was selling 30,000 to 40,000 chests annually at auction. Average auction price was around 1,000 silver dollars per chest. That's 30 to 40 million silver dollars in annual revenue just from the auctions. And this was just one revenue stream among many for the company, but it was becoming the most important one. By the 1830s, opium revenues represented approximately 15% of British India's total government revenue. Let that sink in. 15% of the entire colonial government's income came from producing drugs to export illegally to China. Not a small side business, not an unfortunate compromise, a core pillar of imperial finance. The British Raj, one of history's largest colonial projects, was partially funded by systematic drug production and distribution. Roads, railways, administration, military forces in India were funded in part by Chinese addiction. By the 1850s, after the Opium Wars had forced legalization and expanded the market, opium revenues for the British government reached even higher levels. Some years, opium represented 20% of British India's revenue. In the peak years of the 1880s, the Indian government was earning 70 to 80 million rupees annually from opium. Convert that to modern purchasing power, and you're looking at billions of dollars per year in government revenue from drug production. This created a fundamental problem. The British government became addicted to opium revenue. They needed that money to run India. They needed it to maintain the military. They needed it to fund the colonial administration. Stopping opium production would mean massive budget shortfalls. It would mean raising other taxes, which would cause unrest. It would mean cutting services or military capacity. The British government was economically dependent on Chinese addiction, just as much as Chinese addicts were chemically dependent on opium. And the government knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't accidental. The company's policies deliberately maximized opium production. They forced farmers into opium cultivation, even when it meant food shortages. They set quotas. They punished farmers who didn't meet production targets. They optimized every step of the process to maximize yield and quality. This was industrial agriculture, applied to drug production at government scale. The moral contradiction was obvious. Opium was illegal in Britain itself. British authorities controlled opium sales domestically and restricted its use to medical purposes. They understood it was dangerous and addictive, but in China, they not only allowed it, they produced it, protected the trade militarily, and depended on it financially. The hypocrisy was blatant. And when called out on it, British officials simply argued that China was different, that Chinese people used opium recreationally anyway, that Britain had a right to trade freely. Commissioner Lin Zexu, the Chinese official who tried to stop the opium trade in 1839, wrote directly to Queen Victoria. He pointed out this exact hypocrisy. He asked why Britain banned opium at home but forced it on China. He asked how Britain could claim moral superiority while poisoning another nation for profit. The letter never received an official response because there was no good answer. The British government was knowingly profiting from addiction and chose to ignore the moral implications because the money was too important. When Lin confiscated and destroyed 20,000 chests of opium, he wasn't just attacking merchants. He was attacking British government revenue. Those chests had been produced on government-controlled land, processed in government facilities, sold at government auctions. The destruction represented millions in lost government income. And that's why the British government went to war, not primarily to protect merchant profits, though that mattered, but to protect the government's own financial interests in the opium trade. The First Opium War cost Britain approximately £20 million to fight, but it secured annual opium revenues that would exceed that cost many times over in the following decades. It was an investment. Spend $20 million on military force to secure hundreds of millions in future drug revenue. From a pure financial calculation, ignoring all moral considerations, it was profitable. And that's exactly how the British government calculated it. The Treaty of Nanking in 1842 didn't legalize opium explicitly, but it opened 5 Chinese ports, established extraterritoriality for British citizens, and ceded Hong Kong. This made enforcement of opium bans impossible. British merchants could operate from Hong Kong. British citizens couldn't be tried under Chinese law. Chinese officials lost control of their own ports. The opium trade exploded after the treaty, and British government revenues soared. By the 1850s, the system was fully optimized. India produced opium at industrial scale. Merchants transported it to China at massive volume. China could no longer effectively resist, and the British government collected revenue at every stage. They sold the opium at auction, they taxed the merchant trade, they collected customs duties in the treaty ports they controlled, they profited multiple times from the same product at different stages of the supply chain. The Second Opium War from 1856 to 1860 was even more explicitly about protecting government drug revenues. China was slowly rebuilding enforcement capacity. They were disrupting the trade at the margins. Britain wanted complete legalization and absolute protection for opium imports. So they went to war again, this time with France as an ally. They captured Beijing, burned the old summer palace, forced China to sign treaties that fully legalized opium, and guaranteed Britain's right to import it without restriction. After 1860, opium was completely legal in China. The British government's revenue stream was secured, and the trade reached its peak. By the 1880s, over 80,000 chests were entering China annually. The British Indian government was earning 70 to 80 million rupees per year. The merchants were making enormous profits. The shipping companies were thriving. The insurance companies were collecting premiums. The banks were financing ever larger transactions. An entire economic ecosystem existed around government-produced drugs, and it lasted for another 50 years. Britain didn't seriously begin restricting opium exports until the early 1900s, and even then only under intense international pressure. The trade wasn't fully shut down until the 1920s. That's 90 years of systematic government profiting from addiction, 3 generations, billions upon billions in government revenue extracted from human suffering, money that built railways in India, funded armies, paid colonial administrators, supported the British Empire's expansion and maintenance. Where did that government money go? Into infrastructure that still exists, into institutions that are still operating, into military capacity that shaped global politics, into systems of trade and finance that evolved into modern globalization. The opium revenue wasn't spent on frivolous luxuries. It was invested in the infrastructure of empire, and that infrastructure, those systems, those institutions, they're still here. The origin is hidden, but the benefits compound over time. The British government's role in the opium trade wasn't passive. It wasn't just turning a blind eye to merchant crimes. It was active participation, direct production, deliberate policy, strategic military intervention to protect drug revenues. This was state-sponsored drug dealing at the highest level, and it proves something dark about economics and power. If the profits are large enough, if the money is important enough, governments will rationalize anything. They'll protect drug trades, they'll wage war to force acceptance of addiction, they'll ignore moral arguments, because power requires money, and governments will get that money however they can. But even the government revenues weren't the final level of opium fortunes. Because wars themselves created wealth, military contractors profited, weapons manufacturers profited. And the territories seized, the ports opened, the indemnities paid, all of that created new wealth for British investors, companies, and speculators. The war profits and post-war windfalls were the third massive wave of opium fortunes. And that's where the story gets even darker. The opium wars weren't just about protecting an existing trade. They were wealth-generating events in themselves. Wars create opportunities for profit if you're on the winning side and positioned correctly. And British investors, companies, and speculators were positioned perfectly to extract wealth from forcing China to accept drugs. The Treaty of Nanking in 1842 forced China to pay 21 million silver dollars in reparations to Britain, 6 million for destroyed opium, 12 million for war costs, 3 million for debts owed to British merchants. 21 million silver dollars paid by China to Britain for losing a war fought to protect Britain's right to sell drugs. That money went somewhere. It went to the British government, which distributed portions to merchants who had lost opium in Lynn's destruction. It went to military contractors who supplied the war effort. It went into British coffers where it funded further imperial expansion. But the real windfall came from what the treaty opened up. Hong Kong was ceded to Britain permanently, a strategic port that would become the center of Asian trade for the next 150 years. British investors and companies immediately moved in. Land speculation, property development, trade infrastructure, banking services. Jardine Matheson set up their headquarters there. Other trading firms followed. Hong Kong's entire founding economy was built on opium trade capital, and the treaty that gave Britain the territory was won through a war to protect drug dealing. The value of Hong Kong over 150 years of British control is incalculable. Trillions of dollars in trade flowed through it. Thousands of companies operated from there. It became one of the world's major financial centers, and it only existed as a British possession because of the Opium Wars. The fortunes made in Hong Kong real estate, Hong Kong trade, Hong Kong finance over a century and a half, all of that traces back to a war fought to force drugs on China. 5 Chinese ports were open to foreign trade under the treaty: Canton, Shanghai, Ningbo, Fuzhou, Amoy. British merchants flooded in. They established trading houses, warehouses, offices. They negotiated favorable deals. They extracted wealth from Chinese commerce while operating under British law that protected them from Chinese authority. Jardine Matheson and others expanded rapidly into these ports. The opium trade continued, but now they could also trade in legitimate goods with preferential access. The war had converted illegal smugglers into legal traders with government protection. Shanghai became particularly important. It grew from a relatively small port into one of China's largest cities, specifically because of the foreign trade that exploded after the Opium Wars. British, American, and European trading firms built entire districts. They controlled customs. They operated under their own laws. And they made massive fortunes from China's forced integration into global trade. The wealth generated in Shanghai over the next century, much of it flowing to British investors, was a direct consequence of the military action taken to protect opium. The Second Opium War created even more opportunities. The Treaty of Tientsin in 1858 and the Convention of Peking in 1860 fully legalized opium and opened 11 more ports. Foreigners gained the right to travel in China's interior. Christian missionaries gained access. Foreign diplomats could reside in Beijing. And China had to pay another massive indemnity. 8 million taels of silver to Britain, 8 million to France. These war reparations extracted more wealth directly from China and transferred it to European governments and the merchants who had war claims. But the legalization of opium was the biggest prize. After 1860, the trade was completely legal and protected. No more smuggling risks, no more bribing officials, no more operating in legal gray zones. Opium could be imported openly, taxed officially, and distributed freely. The market exploded. By the 1880s, annual imports exceeded 80,000 chests. The profits for merchants, shippers, insurers, and the British government multiplied far beyond pre-war levels. The wars had made the drug trade legitimate and vastly more profitable. Insurance companies made fortunes insuring opium shipments. Before the wars, insuring illegal smuggling was risky and premiums were high. After legalization, opium cargo insurance became routine and profitable. Companies like Lloyd's of London underwrote massive opium shipments. Every chest that moved from India to China generated insurance premiums. Over decades, the cumulative premiums on hundreds of millions of pounds of opium represented enormous wealth for the insurance industry. Shipping companies built entire fleets specifically for the opium trade. The famous clipper ships, some of the fastest sailing vessels ever built, were designed primarily to transport opium and tea. Companies that built these ships made fortunes. Companies that operated them made fortunes. The shipyards in Britain that constructed them profited. The supply chain that supported them profited. An entire maritime industry was built around moving drugs and the tea that drugs paid for. Banks financed all of it. Merchant houses needed capital to buy opium at auction in Calcutta. Chinese distributors needed credit to buy from the merchants. Trade required letters of credit, currency exchange, payment settlements. HSBC, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, was founded in 1865 specifically to finance the trade between China, India, and Britain. The opium trade was a major part of their early business. They financed opium transactions. They handled the silver and currency movements. They made their initial fortune facilitating drug trade finance. HSBC still exists today. It's one of the largest banks in the world, over $2.5 trillion in assets, operates in dozens of countries, serves millions of customers. Their corporate history mentions being founded in Hong Kong in 1865 to facilitate international trade. It doesn't emphasize that much of that early international trade was opium. The bank's founding capital and early profits came substantially from financing drug dealing. But given 160 years in diversification into legitimate banking, that origin becomes a historical footnote rather than a defining characteristic. This is how opium fortunes become old money. A merchant makes billions from opium. He invests in property, railways, shipping, banking. His children inherit diversified assets. Not just drug money, they invest in new industries. After 3 or 4 generations, the family wealth is vast and completely disconnected from its origin in any practical sense. The money remembers, but people forget. Jardine Matheson's evolution is the perfect example. Founded 1832 as an opium trading company, dominated the opium trade for decades, made enormous fortunes, then gradually diversified into legitimate businesses. Railways in China, real estate in Hong Kong, shipping lines, insurance, retail. By the early 1900s, when international pressure forced reductions in opium trade, Jardine Matheson had already converted drug profits into diverse business holdings. The opium money had been laundered through time and investment. Today, Jardine Matheson Holdings is worth over $40 billion. They own Dairy Farm, a major retailer across Asia. They own Hong Kong Land, a major property company. They own Mandarin Oriental Hotels. They have automotive dealerships, construction businesses, restaurants. None of these current operations involve drugs. They are completely legitimate businesses. But the founding capital that started the conglomerate came from the largest drug distribution operation in 19th century history. Other opium merchants' fortunes followed similar paths. Families invested in Britain's Industrial Revolution, railways, factories, mines. They bought estates and became landed gentry. They married into aristocracy. They donated to universities and had buildings named after them. Oxford and Cambridge have buildings funded by opium money. The donors were celebrated for their philanthropy. Nobody asked where the money came from. Or, if they did ask, the donors' framing of it as trade with China rather than drug dealing was accepted. The total wealth created by the opium trade over its roughly 100-year peak from 1780s to 1880s is impossible to calculate exactly, but we can estimate. Tens of billions in merchant profits, hundreds of millions in government revenue annually for decades, billions in war reparations, trillions in subsequent trade and development in the ports and territories opened by the wars. The compounding effect of all that capital invested over 150 plus years into legitimate businesses, real estate, and financial assets creates wealth that numbers in the hundreds of billions in today's money. And most of it is completely disconnected from its origin now. The families that made opium fortunes in the 1800s are aristocratic, wealthy, respectable today. The companies founded with opium money are major corporations. The banks that finance the trade are global financial institutions. The insurance companies that covered the shipments are established firms. The territories seized in opium wars became major cities and trading hubs. The infrastructure built with opium revenue still functions. The system that created the wealth has disappeared, but the wealth remains, compounded, legitimized, and embedded in the modern economy. And here's why this matters in 2025. Because the pattern is repeating. The Sackler family and Purdue Pharma created OxyContin, an opioid painkiller. They marketed it aggressively as less addictive than other opioids. That was false. They knew it was highly addictive. They had studies showing addiction rates were high. They suppressed that information and pushed the drug anyway. They made approximately $35 billion in revenue from OxyContin between 1996 and 2019. The strategy was identical to the opium merchants. Create a product that generates dependency. Build distribution networks through doctors and pain clinics. Downplay addiction risks. Maximize profit. When confronted with the human cost, deny responsibility. The Sacklers made billions while hundreds of thousands died from opioid overdoses. The death toll from the American opioid crisis now exceeds 500,000, and the family kept most of their money. Purdue Pharma declared bankruptcy in 2019. The Sacklers agreed to pay $6 billion in settlements, but they were worth an estimated $11 billion. They kept $5 billion. They admitted no wrongdoing. The settlement gave them immunity from future civil lawsuits, so they paid a fine that was less than their profits, kept billions, avoided criminal prosecution, and got legal protection from victims' families. Just like the opium merchants made fortunes, faced minimal consequences, and kept their money, the pattern hasn't changed. Create dependency for profit. Use legal and political power to protect the operation. When forced to stop, pay a fine smaller than the profits and move on. The Sacklers will likely follow the same path as Jardine and Matheson. In 50 years, their grandchildren will be respectable members of society. The money will have been invested in legitimate businesses. The origin will be downplayed, and the fortune will persist, laundered through time. This is what Opium Fortunes teaches us. Massive wealth can be created through systematic harm. That wealth, once created, becomes increasingly legitimate over time. Institutions built on immoral foundations become respected institutions. Money made from addiction becomes old money that funds universities, museums, hospitals. The pattern that created it is forgotten or reframed as aggressive business practices rather than systematic poisoning. The families that addicted China to opium are still wealthy. The companies they founded still operate. The banks that finance the trade are global institutions. The territories seized are major cities. The infrastructure built with drug money still functions. And pharmaceutical companies are using the exact same playbook right now with prescription opioids, making billions while people die, knowing they'll probably face fines smaller than their profits and keep most of the money. Understanding the opium fortunes isn't just history. It's understanding how massive illegal wealth becomes respectable, how systemic harm creates generational prosperity for perpetrators, how economic incentives override moral considerations, how power protects profit regardless of human cost, and how the pattern repeats because it keeps working. If you want to track modern pharmaceutical wealth, if you want to understand where drug money goes and how it's laundered into legitimacy, subscribe to this channel. Hit the notification bell, because we're going to continue following the money. We're going to track the Sackler fortune. We're going to examine HSBC's modern operations and their continued financial scandals. We're going to show you how old money from drugs became new money, from drugs became respectable money that builds museums and endows universities. The next video will cover HSBC's founding in detail, how a bank created specifically to finance opium trade became one of the world's largest financial institutions, how drug money literally built the bank, and how that origin still influences their behavior 160 years later. Because institutions remember their purpose even when people forget their origin, the opium fortunes didn't disappear, they transformed. And understanding that transformation is the key to recognizing the pattern when it happens again, which it is right now, with the same economic logic, the same moral blindness, the same protection of profit over people. Subscribe and stay informed. Because the pattern doesn't end until enough people recognize it and refuse to accept it.